I do want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking about my experience as a South Asian person, but while a lot of us do demand visibility and to be heard and to talk about intersectional climate justice, I want to acknowledge that there's really no justice without Indigenous justice, and we are meeting on stolen land today. So I started in the climate movement in 2019. 350,000 people marched across this country and called for climate action. We skipped school, we did all of that. I spent so many hours in meetings, and I'm sure, Karita, I know you did as well. And a lot of us still do that. And instead of actually listening to us or taking into account, what we're calling for, I think Monash decided to enter into the partnership with Woodside like at the very end of 2019 or at the start of 2020. So it's just a bit like, I don't know how that happened. And it's the same with the government. The government has continued to approve new fossil fuel projects. In May this year, our wonderful new Environment Minister, Murray Watt, approved Woodside's Northwest Shelf Gas Project. Shame. And this not only produces an eye-watering amount of emissions, but also sits next to what is considered as the most significant Indigenous rock art in the world. And Murray Watt was there lobbying against the recognition of it as a World Heritage Site. Luckily, it did get World Heritage recognition, and hopefully we can actually move forward and make sure that it's protected. But this site is so important. And just days before receiving approval, Meg O'Neill, the CEO of Woodside, Australia's largest independent dedicated oil and gas company, said, she basically blamed it on young people. She said that instead of looking at fossil fuels as bad and renewables as good, we need to think about our consumption because we're on sites like Timu. So instead of actually thinking about the systemic impact that corporations like Woodside have, apparently it's our fault because we're on Timu and Shein. And none of this is about ideology, because young people like myself, and I feel like most people here, do actually recognize the impact on carbon emissions. Just this morning, I was chatting to somebody about flights and, oh my gosh, should I take the 12-hour or 13-hour train ride to Sydney instead? And it's those kinds of conversations that we're forced to have because corporations like Woodside think that what they're doing is actually for the good of the country. And what's really interesting is that Market Forces did some analysis, and they found that to reach Woodside's current emissions, it would take every single young Australian purchasing 4,888 t-shirts per year. So that's the level of impact. Each of us here would have to buy almost 5,000 t-shirts. And a 2017 report found that 70% of carbon dioxide emissions worldwide come from just 100 companies. And since 1988, just 100 companies have been responsible for 71% of the emissions. Shame. And now there's so many statistics out there, and I could just keep regurgitating all this incredible data that we have. But I think a lot of the time these stats actually take out the human impact, because climate change actually affects us as individuals in our daily lives. Over the last few months, we've actually heard about the floods in Australia. And of course, we had bushfire season 2019, 2020. We've heard about the floods in Florida and, of course, the heat waves in UK. But what about the unbelievably hot heat waves in India and Pakistan in 2024 and 2025? These heat waves that usually start in May and June began in April with record-breaking temperatures. And these conversations about impacts in South Asia are generally left behind. People seem to think that if it's affecting Europe or Australia or the US, it's front and center, it makes the media headlines. But what about the rest of the world? South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions, and the Australian Defence website actually says that more than 750 million people in South Asia have been impacted by one or more climate-related disasters in the past 2 decades. And so the Australian government's clearly aware of what they're doing. Last month and the month before, India and Pakistan were demolished by floods. In just 2 days, 307 people died and 23 were injured in Pakistan. There's several missing in the region of Kashmir, and Pakistan's Disaster Management Authority actually estimated this year's monsoon season to be 65% more intense than last year, and that's purely because of climate change. And similarly in India, they've said that that's what's happening with these heat waves, that they are being fueled by climate change. And so my mom grew up in Bengaluru, a city in India, which she said used to be called the Garden City. I've been there a few times and I don't know if I call it that anymore. Every time I visit, the heat is much stronger, the air feels dirtier, and all this is air pollution and climate change. And corporations like Woodside constantly putting their interests and short-term profits over people across the world. And my favorite memory going to India is actually this amazing cultural museum called Janapadaloka. And it's really pretty tall, lush trees, like grass fields, everything. And I remember being there with my cousin when she was 3. And now when I think about going to India and when I think about going to that site, I'm always like, I wonder if it's still there, because India has faced so many climate impacts and much of this is just not seen. And I worry about, my 12-year-old cousin now growing up breathing that air that is being polluted by these large corporations. And if Bengaluru was a garden city and had all that lush greenery, what does it mean for the rest of India? And I know that these communities in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan actually contribute the least to climate change but are affected the most, and their voices need to be part of the conversation when we talk about corporations like Woodside. It's not just Australia that's facing the impact, but you can actually see the solidarity between Indigenous communities here and in India as well, who have been resisting corporations like this for decades. But what it tells us is a fossil fuel industry is a colonial project. It's creating divisions with communities and destroying Indigenous land, claiming to create jobs and cheapen our energy bills when we know that the cheapest energy will not be coming from fossil fuels. And despite this, Woodside has found its allies in the Murdoch media, the government, and apparently institutions like Monash, which decided to partner with Woodside in the name of sustainability. Let's move forward and create more gas. And Woodside is supported by myths and points of deflection like Meg O'Neill, who blame young people, and the narrative that Australia's emissions don't really matter because India and China don't understand environmentalism. But environmentalism in India actually dates back to decades ago with the Chipko movement, where they were known as the tree huggers because they were trying to stop deforestation. And it really does come to us, unfairly, but rightly so, that we break these myths and recognise that countries like Australia and the institutions in Australia, like this university, have a big responsibility to lead the transition to renewables and not proudly talk about their partnerships with fossil fuel companies. And if anything, after graduating from a 5.5-year-long law degree from UCID, I can say that I wish I was more proud to say that I went to UCID, but with their own investments in fossil fuels, with the repression of protest on campus, I can say that it feels a little bit embarrassing. And I feel like a university like Monash, which actually did announce divestment in 2016, but has clearly backtracked, they'd probably want their students to feel proud about attending this university, calling themselves an alum. And as Amanda said, universities have been central for protests and activism, shaping minds and fostering progress. A partnership with Woodside is literally the antithesis to that. All I can say is that, this turnout right here is clearly something to be proud of, and that building there isn't. I get that it's sustainable, but also we can take the name out. So that's all I want to say, and thank you so much for listening.